The Fireflight disaster is quite possibly the worst industrial accident of our time, resulting in the deaths of over 100 workers and millions of dollars in damages. But it wasn't until recently when a survivor came forward with some truly stunning information about what he witnessed in the building that day that alludes that this incident might actually be one of the most elaborate government cover-ups in history. Now, with that said, I am your host, Uriah Baker, and welcome to Tales of the Clockwork. For 32-year-old Ammon Payne, it was a typical morning. He woke up, took a shower, got dressed, and went downstairs for breakfast. He ate with his two young boys, kissed his wife, said his goodbyes to everyone, and then headed to work. But little did he know, this would be the last time that he would get to see his family. Ammon worked on a government project called Project Fireflight, and this was a known industrial project that worked on engineering the nation's large robotic war machines. The building he worked in primarily focused on the forging and development of the individual parts that would then be shipped to another facility for assembly. There were various stations in the facility, but the general layout consisted of a blast furnace that would melt and separate molten iron into slag. Slag is the byproduct that is made from smelting and is usually waste materials and impurity in the metal that is rendered out in the process. And then there were these coal injectors and ovens that were used to pump oxygen into this mixture in order to turn the molten iron into steel. Once the molten steel was created, it would then be separated into these large tanks that would dispense the steel into molds and then cast them into the various parts of the machines. When the items were cast and cooled, they would be placed on this very long conveyor belt that would then funnel these objects through a very hot furnace, where the pieces would then be heated to a near melting point before being quenched in oil baths, in order to temper the steel, which was a process of refining and strengthening steel. Once the pieces were cooled from the quenching process, they would then sit in a storage and wait to be shipped to a nearby facility for assembly. When Ammon arrived to work that day, he first checked in at a building near the Fireflight facility to get changed into his heat-resistant suit. These buildings were extremely hot, and all of the employees were required to wear this insulated gear that covered their entire bodies and had a cooling system built into it. Once changed and checked in, he and the other members of his shift were escorted to the facility to begin work for the day. Now, all around the top of the facility were these catwalks where the managers would be stationed to oversee the operations of the grounds crew, which was made up of about 75 workers at any single time, and this included the people that were operating the equipment, the safety teams, and the maintenance crew. Ammon was part of one of the maintenance teams during this shift. As part of the start of his shift routine, all of the machinery went through a routine maintenance check, and the team that Ammon was assigned to this day was for the blast furnace. Once Ammon and his crew cleared the blast furnace for operation, and the rest of the teams also cleared the other equipment, all of the equipment was turned on and operational. Everything during this shift had gone very smoothly until about 3 p.m. At this point, the slag exit chute on the blast furnace became clogged. Buildup in these chutes didn't happen very often just due to the routine cleaning, but when they did, protocol was to shut down all devices in the assembly lines prior to the blast furnace to ensure the safety of the teams that were unclogging this chute. Once everything was turned off, an internal device inside the blast furnace would then seal off the upper portion so that slag wouldn't continue to drip down this vent as it was being cleared, and the molten iron wouldn't pass through on the other side as well. Ammon and his team were then called in to fix the clog in this machine, but for some reason the shift supervisor, Cornelius, told the other members of the crew to leave the machines on that came before the blast furnace in order to keep their production going for the day. So that meant that molten iron ore was still being pushed into the furnace despite the bottom of it being completely sealed off. And during subsequent investigations of Cornelius, it was revealed that he very often skipped safety protocol in order to try to meet the daily quota for production. So Ammon and his team, they go under the blast furnace where this slag chute is located and move it to the side since it was on sort of a pivot that allowed it to move out of the deposited area so that they would be able to clean it. And they began working on dislodging this clog in the pipe. This procedure could sometimes take up to 30 minutes, and while the crew was working, several other employees on the catwalk came up to Cornelius and said, "You need to turn off these other machines just for the safety protocol and the team members that are down there," but Cornelius didn't listen. After about 20 minutes of Ammon and his crew working on this clog, he began to hear this faint clicking sound, and then it got a little bit louder and then a little bit louder. He told his crew to stop what they were doing, and they all listened closely and heard this clicking sound getting louder and louder. That's when Ammon looked up and saw this large crack forming along the side of the blast furnace. Ammon quickly turned to run, but a second later, the furnace exploded. Massive pieces of shrapnel from the furnace launched through the entire work area of the building, along with the molten iron ore that was inside of it. Many of the people that survived the initial blast were either trapped by the molten iron that was now covering the building, or they would then lose their lives in a second explosion that took place in the oil quenching wells once the iron sort of penetrated that area of the building. It took emergency services 13 hours to get the fire in this building under control, and of the total 126 workers, only 12 would survive. But that isn't where our story ends. That is the story that the mainstream media and news outlets told about this event. But since the Fireflight disaster, many have questioned the legitimacy of this narrative surrounding the incident. For many people, the information about the events that took place in the building simply didn't add up or generally looked suspicious. For example, the entire day of this incident, all of the cameras in the building, outside the building, in the check-in building, coincidentally malfunctioned. So there was absolutely no video footage of this incident occurring at all. The survivors of the incident that have been interviewed have also been accused of sounding scripted, providing inauthentic responses and reactions to what they witnessed. And on top of that, these facilities had extremely strict safety protocols. And the idea that an incident of this magnitude could have occurred due to safety neglect is very unlikely, considering the amount of money that the government poured into these projects. Cornelius, who was the shift supervisor that supposedly made this call to leave the other machinery on during the maintenance of the smelter, was very out of character according to some testimony from family members and the family members of other employees. Previously, other employees had described Cornelius as someone who always put safety first and cared more about the workers than he actually did the daily quota, which is the exact opposite of how this story was originally told. As different theories about the events that took place in this building began to emerge, primary news outlets continued to report on the story, repeatedly stating that the events that took place in this building were tragic, they were an accident, and that spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories is disrespectful and disgraceful to those who lost their lives and their grieving family members. But this is where we come to someone by the name of Cephas Ashton. Cephas was one of the 12 survivors of the Fireflight disaster, and just like everyone else, for months he told the exact same story to the press as everyone else that survived that incident. But very recently, in some interviews and letters with some non-mainstream news sources, his story would not only change, but he would single-handedly identify the Fireflight disaster as being one of the most elaborate government cover-ups in history. Shortly after Cephas began sharing his version of what happened in the Fireflight facility that day, he vanished. His close friends and family stated that he just moved due to being harassed by people trying to pry information about this accident and refused to tell anyone his location or where he had gone. Some people began to speculate that his disappearance was more than just moving, and he was actually taken hostage by the government in order to silence his efforts in sharing his account of what he claims to have witnessed in the Fireflight building that day. The following is a recreation of events based on the letters and interviews that Cephas shared prior to his disappearance. The morning of the incident, Cephas woke up, got ready for work, looked in the mirror, took a deep breath, and began to mentally prepare himself for what was about to happen that day. He didn't know all of the information, he only knew his role in the operation and was told to wait for further instructions before initiating his part of the plan. When he arrived to work, he, along with everyone else, stopped in at the checkpoint, put on their heat-resistant suits, and were escorted to the facility. For the next several hours, everything was going smoothly and happening as usual in the facility. At around 3 p.m. though, an alarm began going off in the building. This alarm was something that could be triggered manually and was used to alert the building to sort of go on standby, turn off all their machines, and wait because there could be a potentially dangerous situation with something going on in the assembly line. The alarm went off for only a few minutes before stopping, and then an announcement was made over the intercom for everyone to direct their attention to the top of the catwalk. Cephas said in an interview that when he looked to the top of the catwalk, it looked like there was this man strapped to a chair looking over the entire facility. Another person then approached him from behind and announced to everyone that he had the great Silas Steele. The person that Cephas believed was making this announcement was Rufus Roxwell, the human figurehead for the government. And Silas, the man in the chair, was the founder of Project Fireflight before Rufus took over, and while the employees at Fireflight continued to do their jobs, rumors began to emerge that the employees loyal to Silas were starting to stage a coup, and they were going to rise up against local government in protest of government procedures. Cephas wasn't able to hear everything that went on at the top of the catwalk, but his description of it was that it sort of looked like there was an interrogation happening, and it wasn't really audible to the others in the facility. After several minutes of observing this interrogation take place, Rufus then turned to everyone in the building and announced that Silas had refused to speak. From behind Rufus, a very large, shadowy figure then stepped forward. Cephas identified this large figure as Sekhmet, or also known as the Lioness, who is one of the clockwork goddesses that truly govern the land. With a commanding voice, she said, "Let the killing floors begin." And within a matter of moments, the building was swarmed with military officers as employees were being rounded up. The employees were then brought up to one of the lower catwalks and forced onto the conveyor belts where the molds of the castings usually went to be funneled into the furnace. Once all of the employees that were not part of Rufus's crew were in place on this conveyor belt, Rufus announced for the operator to pull the trigger. This is where Cephas comes in. He was planted in this building months ago as the conveyor belt operator, so he did exactly as he was told. He pulled the trigger and watched as these employees were funneled into a furnace. Afterwards, the remaining military and crew that were inside the building intentionally clogged the blast furnace and rigged it to explode, which resulted in the building catching fire and the machinery inside exploding. One thing that Cephas noted in these interviews is that he didn't understand why these people died so calmly. He described them as looking up at Silas with their hands over their hearts, their heads held high, as they were just funneled into this furnace to their death. Eventually, it was guilt that brought Cephas to reveal this information publicly. He said that not only himself, but several others, including other employees in the building that were part of Rufus's crew and family members, were paid off in order to stay silent and conduct this operation. As of now, some believe that Cephas has been taken prisoner of the state for releasing this information and that... Hold on a second. I don't know if you can hear that, but it sounds like someone is outside the studio. Hold on a second.
Put your hands up!
Oh, okay.
All right. Now sit down!
Okay. All right.
Turn off the camera! I said
Go.
turn off the camera!